Hey, what's up guys? Welcome to Curious Kingdom. Today we are recapping action-adventure Disney series Moon Knight. Soft music plays as we begin with a man placing a cloth on a surface and pouring himself a drink. He dips his finger in water and circles the glass rim before wrapping it in the cloth and smashing it with a cane. Then, he pours the broken glass into a pair of slippers and puts them on. With the cane in hand, he enters a large empty house, accompanied by 60s pop music. We meet Stephen Grant as he wakes up. He releases the restraint on his right ankle and moves away from his bed, surrounded by a small frame of sand. Stephen calls his mother while feeding his one-fin goldfish, Gus. He leaves a voicemail for his mom and encounters a broom vendor right outside his door as he exits. Stephen catches a bus to the British Museum in London, where there's an exhibit on ancient Egypt. He explains mummification to a young girl to illustrate the ritual but gets interrupted by his boss, Donna, who mistakenly calls him Stevie. He corrects her to call him Stephen, and she scolds him for tour guiding instead of selling gifts from the shop. Another colleague approaches Stephen to confirm plans for steak at 7 the next night. He can't recall and assumes she's asking him out. She giggles and walks away, while Donna returns and asks him what a vegan would eat in a steakhouse. When he rebuffs her remark, she walks away. Later, while closing up, Donna continues to scold Stephen for being late, which is why she assigned him to inventory. He tries to point out historical inaccuracies in the museum's merchandise, but Donna dismisses his concerns and jokes about the mistakes. As he leaves, Stephen says goodbye to a security guard who greets him as Scotty. Stephen corrects her by saying it's Stephen with a V while eating. He explains his sleepwalking to a gold-painted street performer who resembles the man with glass-filled slippers from the beginning. Stephen helps the performer by tipping him and assisting in attracting tourists for photos. He concludes that he needs to overcome his sleepwalking if he wants to commit to a girlfriend. After tipping the mime once more, he leaves, and we see his reflection in a puddle as a green leaf lands on it, creating ripples. Stephen spreads the sand around his bed and locks all the locks on his door. He secures the ankle restraint in place and starts listening to a podcast about staying awake. As he fiddles with a Rubik's Cube, we see clips of him engaging in other activities to keep his mind alert, such as reading about the Aeneid, following the podcast's suggestion to read as a way to stay awake. Suddenly, he hears the podcast mention thinking of himself as part of the story. In an abrupt shift, he wakes up in a grassy field, feeling intense pain in his jaw. He stands up and hears a voice advising him to go back to sleep, instructing him to surrender control of his body. When he expresses confusion, the voice dismissively calls him an idiot. Stephen takes a gold scarab from his pocket just as a figure approaches him from behind, carrying a staff. He turns around and realizes he's trespassing on a castle's property, prompting guards to open fire on him. The voice urges him to flee, and he runs away as the guards continue to shoot at him, missing with each attempt. He arrives in a part of the town where a man named Harrow, resembling the glass-filled slippers man, is being welcomed by the townspeople who clear a path for him. Harrow leads them to the open town square and comments on the beauty of the day with an American accent. He tells the people that their mission is to make the earth resemble heaven as much as possible, then asks who wants to go first. A random man steps forward, greeted by Harrow, who commends him for offering his soul for judgment and waiting to serve their goddess even before she awakens. Harrow places a cane in the man's hands, and he performs a ritual to judge in the name of Ammit, the Egyptian funerary deity associated with death. Stephen and the other townspeople watch as Harrow's scale tattoo on his right arm faintly glows before he declares the person a good man and hugs him. Meanwhile, the guards are still searching for Stephen among the onlookers. Harrow reveals his name as Arthur, and a woman presents herself to him. Stephen observes as his scale tattoo tips to one side and turns red. Arthur apologizes to the woman, who then receives Ammit's judgment and collapses, lifeless. People carry her away. The armed guards, who had been chasing Stephen, approach Arthur and inform him that they were ambushed during the exchange, resulting in the deaths of 2 of their men. To identify the spy, Arthur issues an order in ancient Egyptian, immediately exposing Stephen. Stephen identifies himself to the crowd as Stephen Grant from the British Museum's gift shop. Arthur demands that he return the scarab, but the voice in Stephen's head urges him not to comply. Unaware of the consequences, Stephen resists handing over the scarab. The crowd surrounds him and forcibly takes the scarab from his grasp. He blacks out and regains consciousness when he hears the voice saying, "Oh no, the idiot's back." Now, he finds himself standing in the same spot, with blood on his hand and several townspeople lying unconscious, possibly dead, around him, holding the scarab. As he escapes in an American van with the driver's seat on the left, the voice insists that he must not let go of the scarab. While listening to Wham on the radio, Stephen is pursued by multiple cars, all with non-British driver's seats. The situation escalates, and once again, Stephen blacks out, only to awaken with the windshield shattered and an assailant dead, with Stephen holding a pistol. The voice now threatens him not to lose the scarab. leaving Stephen with little time to seek clarification as he narrowly avoids a truck carrying logs. Stephen panics, blacks out again, and regains consciousness just as the last Jeep blocks his path and a car tumbles off the road. The voice scolds him for losing his gun as two guards approach the stalled van. As panic sets in, the logs from the truck crash onto the lower roadway, taking out the guards and abruptly awakening Stephen, who finds himself safely back in his flat, restrained to his bedpost. He feels relieved and proceeds with his morning routine, including feeding Gus, noticing that the fish's fin has miraculously regrown. At a pet show, an associate is thoroughly perplexed by Stephen's strange behavior. He can't recall his visit to the pet store the previous day, but upon realizing it shortly after 5 p.m., he remembers he's supposed to have a date. Stephen dresses up at home and heads to the restaurant for the date. However, when his date doesn't show, Stephen calls her, reminding her of their 7 p.m. Friday plans. She informs Stephen that today is Sunday and instructs him to lose her number. Completely bewildered and heartbroken, Stephen reluctantly places an order without understanding how to order steak. On his mom's voicemail, he concocts a story about the date as he walks home. He flicks the light in his apartment on and off before indulging in a box of chocolates he had bought for his date, accidentally dropping some sprinkles into Gus's goldfish tank. While picking up the fallen chocolates, he starts noticing strange things in his apartment and investigates behind a loose board above his pantry. There, he discovers a car key and a cell phone with several missed calls from Layla and one from Dutcham. He calls Layla, who is surprised that he's still alive after many months and questions the sudden appearance of a British accent, identifying him by his true name, Mark. When Stephen asks why she called him that, the call abruptly ends. Hearing his name being called, Stephen tries to see who it is. After the voice instructs him to stop, the lights begin to flicker and Stephen runs scared from his flat to the elevator. In the elevator, he gazes at his reflection as it continues its descent. On the second floor, Stephen experiences a hallucination of a creature coming for him, and just as he comes face to face with its beak, he wakes up on a bus. Everyone on the bus is staring at Stephen, who notices the figure standing on the side of the road and then realizes Arthur is on the bus as he exits. Upon entering the museum, he attempts to seek help from JB, the security guard he encountered before, but gets interrupted by Donna. Stephen spots Arthur in the museum and excuses himself from Donna, following a man he saw on the bus and soon confronted by Arthur walking with his cane. As he seeks assistance from another security guard, this guard reveals his scale tattoo and enthusiastically exclaims, "Praise Amit." Arthur proceeds to explain the philosophy of Amit to Stephen. Amit, tired of waiting for sinners to commit their sins before punishing them, judges our entire lives, including our futures that remain hidden from us. In response, Stephen makes a witty remark, suggesting that historical documents have overlooked this aspect. Arthur believes that Amit was betrayed and imprisoned by lazy fellow gods. Had she been free, she might have prevented significant historical tragedies like the fall of the Holy Roman Empire and the Holocaust, among others. Arthur discloses to Stephen that Amit was betrayed by her own avatar, a term Stephen only knows from popular culture. Furthermore, Arthur is aware of the voice in Stephen's head and arranges for Stephen to be judged by Amit. As the cane holding the scale dangles before Stephen, Arthur's scale tattoo trembles uncontrollably, signifying inner turmoil. The doors to another exhibit open, prompting Stephen to flee from Arthur, who instructs the guards to let him go. Alone, Arthur conducts inventory as the museum closes. However, he hears a distant dog's cries and follows the sound. Unbeknownst to him, Stephen is also being trailed. While hiding from an unseen threat, Arthur announces through the museum that Stephen must return the scarab. Stephen seeks refuge in the men's bathroom, where he encounters his true alter ego, Mark Spector, in the mirror. Mark explains the necessity for Stephen to relinquish control fully if they want to survive the impending attack. Stephen agrees, allowing Mark to take over just as the creature breaks in and assaults him. The creature attempts to escape but is forcibly pulled back and defeated, seemingly to its final demise, by a hero dressed in light gray attire with a face-covering cowl, a hood, and a cape, who goes by the name Moon Knight. When Stephen wakes up, he hears the jackal, the creature we saw earlier, and finds himself once again chained to his bed. He inquires if Mark is present in the mirror, but Mark does not respond. He then heads back to work to confirm if the previous night was real, but at the museum, they are repairing the damage caused by the jackal. Stephen questions the security guard about the incident, and the guard informs him that they are attributing it to burst pipes. Stephen asks if anyone viewed the security footage, and the guard mentions that he's about to check it. In the camera room, they watch the footage, and to their surprise, they witness Stephen sobbing in a corner and running away from something invisible. However, they find nothing else except Stephen in the footage. The guard reassures him, saying, "It's still you." It becomes evident that Arthur possesses the ability to conjure horrors that exist only in his plane of reality. Stephen disputes the footage, claiming it's not him, and notices Mark looking back at him through the camera. Unfortunately, the museum authorities identify him as the culprit behind the bathroom destruction and decide to terminate his employment, referring him to a psychologist. They do not intend to press charges, they simply want him to leave. Before leaving, the security guard asks if Stephen has any museum property in his possession. And Stephen is sure of only 2 items, the cell phone and the storage locker key. Stephen seeks out the gold-painted man once again to recount the strange events that have transpired. He swears that he discovered hidden items in his apartment, even though the man remains silent. Stephen feels compelled to explore these findings and believes that locating the storage locker may be his only chance to prove his sanity. After thanking the man, he departs and eventually arrives at the storage facility. There, he inquires about his storage locker, providing the names Stephen Grant and Mark. The security recognizes Stephen and guides him to a storage locker he's never seen before. Inside, it's arranged as if someone had been living there, containing a cot, food, a bag filled with money, and fake passports. One of the passports displays Stephen's photo but bears the name Mark Spector. Additionally, he finds the scarab, which unfolds like a drone. Though he assumes it's a compass, he's uncertain of its purpose. At this moment, Stephen hears Mark's voice from behind him. Mark apologizes, acknowledging that Stephen wasn't meant to discover any of this. He proceeds to explain that Stephen is in danger, and he can protect him as he did the previous night, but he insists that Stephen must not interfere. Stephen reacts angrily, demanding to know what Mark is. Mark reveals that he serves the god of the moon, Khonshu, and he is Khonshu's avatar. In a way, Stephen is also an avatar of Khonshu, and their duty is to safeguard the vulnerable and deliver Khonshu's justice to those who harm them. Mark made a pact with Khonshu, contingent on Stephen not meddling. Stephen doesn't like this arrangement and plans to take the illegal items from the bag to the police. He is willing to be locked up and even sent to an asylum, hoping that enough medication will rid him of Mark's presence forever. As he exits the storage facility, Khonshu waits for him in the hallway. Stephen attempts to escape but is unable to and turns a corner directly into Khonshu. Khonshu instructs him to return what he took, but Stephen defies this advice and runs into the street, narrowly avoiding a collision with a woman on a moped. Surprisingly, she recognizes him and calls him Mark, and he deduces that she must be Layla. Indeed, she is Layla, and he pleads with her to give him a ride back to his apartment, even though she believes she's talking to Mark. Upon arriving at Stephen's apartment, they discover they share many common interests. He's well-versed in Egyptian history, and she is Egyptian and fluent in French, just like him. Despite this apparent connection, Layla scolds him, pointing out that he knows these things already. She had a clear purpose for coming there. Mark had sent her divorce papers, but they were unsigned. Her mission was to track him down and ensure he signed them. Stephen is taken aback, finding it unbelievable that anyone would want to end their relationship with her. As Stephen insults Mark for being foolish, Mark listens and pleads with Stephen to leave her alone throughout. Stephen disregards Mark's pleas. But just before he's about to reveal the contents of the bag, Mark urgently yells that Stephen will get her killed. This stops Stephen in his tracks, although it doesn't quell Layla's curiosity. She begins to search through the bag and swiftly discovers the scarab. Her anger flares as she recognizes the scarab's significance. It points to Amit's tomb, something she and Mark had fought for together. Now, she believes Mark is divorcing her to keep it for himself. This prompts Stephen to offer her the scarab, stating that he doesn't want it. He once again attempts to explain that he is not Mark but is interrupted when 2 police officers knock on the door. The officers enter and search the premises but don't find Layla. She has vanished. What they do discover is the bag filled with money and the fake passport, which is enough to detain Stephen. When they check the name Mark Spector, they are shocked to find that he is an international fugitive who was involved in an incident at an Egyptian dig site where archaeologists were tied up and shot. Surprisingly, these individuals aren't actual police officers, as they don't take Stephen to a police precinct. In fact, they are working with Harrow. Stephen realizes he's in a dire situation and is visited by Mark in a reflection, who implores him to give him control to deal with these people. However, Stephen hesitates because he witnessed what Mark did in a small village and doesn't want to take lives. Harrow arrives and uncuffs Stephen. As they walk through a small part of town, Harrow explains that this used to be the worst part of town. But after Amit's judgment, it's now so safe that people leave their doors unlocked. While they discuss this, Stephen sees Khonshu, and Harrow notices his reaction. Harrow reassures Stephen not to worry about it, putting his mind at ease. As they enter a building we've seen before, Khonshu throws a tantrum. Everything Khonshu tells Stephen, Harrow has already heard, as Harrow used to be Khonshu's avatar until he escaped. Harrow explains that Khonshu's justice arrives too late, after people have already suffered. Amit recognizes this, which is why she passes judgment before evil deeds are committed. Their mission is to resurrect Amit, which could lead to a better world. However, they believe Stephen possesses the scarab, although he insists he doesn't have it, a statement Harrow finds hard to believe. Stephen has some questions regarding Amit's judgment. He wonders if she would condemn a child based on something that might occur 30 years in the future, or what about individuals who contemplate harming their bosses but never actually carry out those thoughts. Harrow compares this to cutting off a limb to save the body, which doesn't sit well with Stephen because, as he points out, a child isn't a mere limb. Harrow then shows Stephen his cane, which was Amit's gift to her first avatar and contains a sliver of her power. The cane begins to glow purple, and Harrow tells Stephen that he doesn't want to use it but insists that he must hand over the scarab. Mark, aware of the potential consequences, warns Stephen throughout, advising him not to reveal Layla's name but to surrender the body. However, Layla takes matters into her own hands, emerging from a corner and announcing that she possesses a scarab. As she approaches Harrow, Stephen can hear Khonshu telling Mark that there's no deal in this situation, and he needs to fix it. Just before Layla hands the scarab to Harrow, she instructs Stephen to summon the suit, leaving him utterly baffled. As they attempt to escape, it becomes evident that Layla is exceptionally skilled and capable. Harrow realizes he can't let the scarab escape his possession, so he employs the power of the cane to open a portal, releasing a jackal. Stephen and Layla barricade themselves in a room, but the jackal stands outside, ready to break in. Layla begins to explain to Stephen that his real name is Mark, and he possesses a suit that he uses. Mark pleads with Stephen to allow him to take control of the body. However, the jackal bursts through the door and tackles Stephen through a window. In his moment of desperation, Stephen yells, and a suit materializes, but it looks nothing like Mark's. Mark mocks him, stating that he should conjure the ceremonial armor from Khonshu's temple, not resemble a deranged Colonel Sanders. They have no time for further discussion. Stephen starts battling the jackal, though only he can see it. Layla initially believes he's being possessed until she splashes water on the creature and realizes it's indeed a monster attacking him. Although Stephen temporarily knocks out the jackal, it quickly regains its composure and resumes its assault. At this point, Stephen gives it his all, but it's not enough. He needs to relinquish control to Mark, who proves far more effective in combat, ultimately defeating the jackal. Once Mark transforms back from Moon Knight to Mark Spector, he begins searching for the scarab but can't locate it. That's because it fell out of Stephen's possession when he fell out of the window. It's picked up by a homeless man, who is later discovered by Harrow, leading to a grim outcome. Mark faces two significant problems. Firstly, Stephen wants to regain control of the body, but Stephen lacks the necessary power to do so. Stephen vehemently objects, arguing that Mark has no right to take over the body. However, Mark is bound by the deal he made with Khonshu, and he needs to fulfill it. What particularly frustrates Stephen is that he has finally come to realize all the issues in his life, including his sleepwalking, difficulty dating, and the need to restrain himself at night, all of which stem from Mark Spector's presence. Mark assures Stephen that once the debt is repaid, he will disappear from Stephen's life forever. During their discussion, they also argue about Mark's relationship with Layla. Mark explains to Stephen that Khonshu intended to make Layla Mark's replacement, and he couldn't allow that to happen, which led to their divorce. This revelation becomes the breaking point for Mark, who becomes fed up with listening to Stephen's objections. In frustration, he shatters the glass to destroy the reflection. Khonshu then visits Mark and reminds him that he was a lifeless corpse when Khonshu found him, making the idea of Mark claiming ownership of the body laughable. Mark swears to Khonshu that they will find the scarab, but Khonshu informs him that it's too late because Harrow already possesses it. This means Mark must reach Amit's tomb first, and the only way to do that is by going to Egypt. Layla, who also wants to go to Cairo. Despite being Egyptian, she needs a fake passport. She consults someone who is not only familiar with her situation but also acquainted with her father. This person advises Layla, hinting that she might have burned too many bridges due to her involvement with stolen relics and antiques. Layla justifies her actions by explaining that she retrieves items from the black market and returns them to their rightful owners. We learn that Layla's father was an archaeologist who, like her, was after the scarab. As Layla heads off to meet Mark in Cairo, Harrow has already arrived with the scarab and directs him to Amit's tomb, speaking in Arabic. Harrow is ecstatic about their discovery and doesn't mind that Mark Spector is in Cairo, as it won't deter him from taking preemptive measures. Mark receives a lead on the possible location of the dig site and meets with an individual. Unfortunately, this person has just been attacked by Arthur's men, and one of them warns Mark that it's too late to find Harrow. A confrontation ensues, and Mark asks if they're dancing or fighting. They attack Mark, but he proves capable of holding his own. However, when it's time for Mark to potentially kill these assailants, Stephen appears in a reflection, pleading with him not to take their lives. This distraction leads to Mark blacking out suddenly. When he regains consciousness, he finds himself in the back of a taxicab. With no recollection of how he got there or where he's headed, he eventually realizes he speaks Arabic and instructs the driver to stop. The taxi driver informs him that they are heading to the airport. Suddenly, Mark spots the men who attacked him exiting a building. He demands answers from them and begins chasing them through the streets. Eventually, he catches up with one of them, but when he starts interrogating the man, he sees his reflection, Stephen, begging him to stop. This distraction allows the man to knock Mark out. Mark experiences another blackout and awakens on the rooftop of a building, surrounded by the lifeless bodies of most of the men. He is baffled about how they reached this point and questions Stephen's involvement. Mark insists it wasn't him responsible for the carnage and inquires who could have done it. They find one of Arthur's men barely alive. Khonshu begins to exert pressure on Mark to extract information from the surviving man. Khonshu drags Mark towards the ledge, threatening to throw him off, but Mark is hesitant, as the man appears to be young. Khonshu continues to press him, arguing that if they spare the man, he might talk. Eventually, Mark concedes and escorts the youth to the edge, demanding to know the location of the dig site. However, the young man refuses to speak, choosing to end his own life rather than reveal the information. This setback necessitates a new plan. Mark proposes the idea of involving the other gods and questions whether they will simply stand by while someone tries to unleash Ammit. He implores Khonshu to summon a meeting with the other gods. But Khonshu hesitates, recalling his past imprisonment in stone as a consequence of such an action. After careful consideration, Khonshu recognizes it as the best course of action and sends a message to the gods that they cannot ignore by altering the sky with his powers. Harrow, aware that he is about to be summoned, instructs the workers to continue digging. The avatars of the gods, including Stephen, gather inside the Great Pyramid, much to Stephen's astonishment. The first avatar Mark encounters is Yatzil, the avatar of Hathor, the goddess of music and love. She inquires whether Khonshu explained how this process works, and Mark admits he's not entirely familiar with it. Yatzil explains that it may feel strange initially but advises him not to resist it, as he will become accustomed to it. The meeting is attended by Horus, Isis, Tefnut, Osiris, and Hathor, who are eager to hear Khonshu's account. Yatzil excuses herself at the insistence of the other gods, who are eager to begin the meeting. However, Osiris, who seems to be leading the meeting, does not harbor a favorable disposition towards Khonshu. He reminds Khonshu of his previous banishment for nearly exposing them and expresses disdain for Khonshu's flamboyance, including his elaborate masks and weapons. Osiris warns Khonshu that further manipulation of the sky will result in his imprisonment in stone. Khonshu proceeds to explain to the gods why he was banished, emphasizing that he didn't forsake humanity like the other gods did. Osiris counters by stating that they trust their avatars to carry out their purposes without drawing excessive attention to themselves. Khonshu argues that avatars alone are insufficient and that they require the power of the gods to return from the overvoid before losing their realm. Osiris reiterates that the avatars currently present are designated for observation only, and the gods have resolved not to interfere in human affairs. They have entrusted the avatars to determine the most appropriate course of action. Khonshu is then asked to state his purpose, and he declares that he is seeking judgment against Arthur Harrow. When the other gods inquire about the charges, Khonshu makes the grave accusation of a conspiracy to release Ammit. In response, the gods summon Arthur Harrow to present his defense. Harrow seizes the opportunity to cast doubt on Khonshu's condition, suggesting that Khonshu may not be in the best state of mind. Amidst this tension, Khonshu directly addresses Arthur in front of the assembly, asking if he desires to raise Ammit from the tomb. Arthur, however, offers a simple response, claiming that he was in the desert at the time. However, if visiting the desert sands were considered a crime, the line of sinners would stretch longer than the Nile itself. Khonshu has been in relentless pursuit of Ammit's tomb ever since he bound Arthur Harrow to his service. Khonshu's obsession is clouded by jealousy and paranoia, which prompts him to interrupt Harrow's speech, accusing Mark of being a deceiver. Harrow presses on, cautioning the gods not to trust the word of a disgraced deity. He points out the evident instability in Khonshu, describing how Mark bears a marriage certificate under the name Mark Spector and employment records under the name Stephen Grant. Harrow has witnessed Mark speaking and threatening himself, leaving him deeply concerned about the multiple personalities within Mark's fractured psyche. He emphasizes that Mark is clearly suffering from insanity. As Khonshu begins to retaliate, the gods intervene, as they do not condone violence within their chamber. Harrow then accuses Khonshu of exploiting Mark in the same way he exploited Harrow and continues to exploit the court. Harrow demands immediate action to prevent further harm. The gods subsequently allow Mark Spector to speak, and he admits that he is unwell and in need of help. However, he stresses that he has committed no offense. Harrow's impassioned speech sways the gods, who ultimately do not view Mark as a significant threat. After the meeting, Yatzil takes Mark aside and reveals a potential alternative. She explains that Amit was buried in secret, and even the gods were kept unaware of the tomb's location. However, there was one individual who knew where the tomb was, a Medjay named Senfu. Senfu was tasked with recording the tomb's location in case the gods decided to bring Amit back. Yatzil informs Mark that finding Senfu may lead them to the tomb, but there's a complication. Senfu's sarcophagus was stolen, and its whereabouts remain a mystery. Nevertheless, if they can locate Senfu's sarcophagus, they may be able to uncover the hidden tomb. Mark finds himself navigating the black market in search of the sarcophagus, but his efforts yield no progress. It's during this frustrating pursuit that he encounters Layla, who astutely observes that Mark's lack of Egyptian heritage and unfamiliarity with the area are impeding his progress. She begins her own inquiries and swiftly identifies someone who possesses the sarcophagus. However, Layla makes it clear that her intentions aren't solely to assist Mark but rather to aid herself and others endangered by Harrow's ambitions. Together, they head to inspect the sarcophagus via boat. During the journey, Layla confronts Mark about his failure to disclose the situation with Stephen. He explains that Stephen was under control until recently but doesn't delve into the specifics of what changed. Curious about their connection, Mark inquires about Layla's history with Stephen, and she reveals that they are old friends who have crossed paths in Madrid. Their rapport suggests a strong and amicable relationship. As a precaution, Mark stashes a bag of supplies under one of the docks, suspecting that they might be followed. Upon reaching their destination, they meet Anton Mogart, the owner of the sarcophagus, who is wealthy and well-connected. Mogart is initially cautious about their motives, but eventually allows them access while keeping a watchful eye. As they inspect the sarcophagus, it becomes evident that there are no direct clues regarding the tomb's location. They realize that they require Stephen's input, even though Mark is reluctant to involve him. Layla heads out to distract potential pursuers while Mark engages Stephen in conversation, seeking hints to locate the tomb. Stephen quickly spots pieces of cloth within the sarcophagus, which he believes may lead to a map indicating the tomb's whereabouts. As Mark begins examining these cloth fragments, he is suddenly confronted by Mogart's head of security. Acting instinctively, Mark disarms the security guard with his own weapon, but two additional guards quickly aim their firearms at him, forcing him to stand down. Mogart is furious, and Layla pleads for mercy, explaining that they were attempting to save lives. However, Harrow arrives and offers Mogart something more enticing than what Mark and Layla could provide. Harrow reveals the scarab and turns his attention to both Layla and Mark, hinting at the commonality between them. Layla struggles with the emotional wounds from her father's death and the deceit of her husband, while Mark understands that revealing the truth to Layla would make her see him as he truly perceives himself. Harrow redirects his focus to Mogart, tempting him with the promise of witnessing real power. Meanwhile, Khonshu stands in the background, urging Mark to summon the suit. Mark complies and begins taking out Mogart's men, while Layla retrieves the cloth fragments. However, Stephen intervenes, ordering Mark to stop and relinquish control of the body. Mark blacks out, and Stephen takes charge, suggesting that they all take a moment to calm down and have a conversation. A sudden attack takes place as Mark is stabbed by an assailant from behind, prompting Stephen to urgently command Mark to regain control of the body before losing consciousness once again. In this chaotic situation, Layla intervenes, engaging multiple attackers. Layla employs her weapon effectively, ultimately taking down one of the attackers. She then grabs a gun and rushes to assist Mark. Amid the chaos, Mark shouts for Layla's attention, discovering Mogart attacking her. In a fierce confrontation, Mark manages to eliminate Mogart and his assailants, saving Layla's life. Khonshu makes an appearance, cryptically mentioning the passage of time. Once they believe they are safe and away from the immediate danger, Layla seeks an explanation from Mark regarding Harrow's cryptic statements about not telling the truth. Although Mark knows the meaning behind Harrow's words, he deflects by suggesting that Harrow was merely attempting to unsettle Layla. Layla, however, is deeply troubled by the fact that she never shared her true reasons for relocating. Their exchange highlights lingering trust issues between them. Subsequently, they journey into the desert and begin assembling the cloth fragments into constellations to form a map. However, they encounter difficulties in this process, and Mark reluctantly acknowledges the need for Stephen's assistance. Stephen takes over and skillfully assembles the map, identifying constellations and stars. Yet, a significant challenge arises. The map was created in a different celestial configuration from today's sky, as stars gradually change their positions over time. This presents a dilemma, as there are no living individuals with knowledge of the sky's appearance when the map was made, given its age. At this juncture, Khonshu recalls the night when the map was created, despite knowing that revealing this information will likely anger the other gods. Khonshu, along with Stephen, manipulates time to revert the sky to its historical configuration. This action results in Khonshu's imprisonment in stone, but before being sealed away, he instructs Stephen to convey a message to Mark, requesting his release. This manipulation of the sky provides Stephen and Layla with a precise location for the tomb. Arthur acknowledges Khonshu's fate and the role he played in it. Khonshu's stone form is placed within the Great Pyramid, where the overseeing avatar informs Harrow that he was correct about Khonshu, who is now bound to the pyramid like his predecessors. Harrow speaks to the imprisoned Khonshu, sharing his intentions to accomplish what Khonshu couldn't, with the victory attributed to Khonshu's torment serving as motivation. Khonshu's stone is secured within a wall alongside other statues, all imprisoned for various reasons. The alteration of the sky by Stephen and Khonshu places a considerable strain on Stephen, rendering him unconscious. Layla attempts to revive him, and during this moment, several of Harrow's men arrive to eliminate them. Layla thwarts the attackers by inserting a flare into their vehicle. As Stephen regains consciousness, they proceed toward the tomb. Layla expresses the need for Mark's involvement, but Stephen refuses due to the pact he and Mark made. According to their agreement, once Mark finished his business with Khonshu, he would vanish from Layla's life permanently. Layla is taken aback by this revelation, as they made this decision without her knowledge. She questions Stephen about his intentions to leave her life without informing her. Stephen clarifies that Mark has already distanced himself from her life, and she acknowledges this. A heated argument ensues between Mark and Stephen. Mark believes the mission is a suicide mission, as without Khonshu, there would be no suit, no healing, and no power. He believes he's better equipped to fight Harrow's men and desires to take control of the body from Stephen. However, Stephen remains silent on the matter. Upon arriving at the dig site, they notice the absence of anyone and begin searching for supplies. Mark makes a final plea to take over the body, but Stephen adamantly refuses once more. He tries to convey that it's for Layla's sake, but Stephen still declines, leaving Mark without a response. As they enter the tomb, they are greeted by a surprising sight. Stephen, who possesses a deep fascination with Egypt, is excited to discover that they are among the first people to set foot inside the tomb. Layla leaves an Arabic inscription on a stone in honor of her father, an archaeologist who dreamt of being here but passed away during a mission. Stephen assures her that her father would be proud of her achievement. As they venture deeper into the tomb, their objective becomes clear, locating Amit's stone prison, the Ushept. In one room, Layla notices spent bullet casings and wonders what they were shooting. They realize they've entered a maze with 6 paths, shaped like the Eye of Horus, a royal symbol and the last form of Amit's avatar. Stephen explains that the Eye of Horus represents the 6 senses: thought, sight, hearing, smell, touch, and the tongue. They decipher that Amit's voice, her final avatar, will be found in the tongue part of the maze. Armed with this knowledge, they proceed with their map. In the next room, they encounter an ancient Egyptian autopsy table stained with fresh blood, raising concerns about their surroundings. They approach an entrance leading to another room, but they're hesitant to follow the trail of blood. Stephen notices an opening above them and decides to investigate. He becomes engrossed in the sights he discovers. Suddenly, they hear a gunshot and distant screams. Something starts dragging a body into the room. Stephen manages to hide and remain safe, but Layla is in imminent danger. As Layla approaches the table, she encounters an ancient Egyptian monster, likely a temple guard tasked with protecting the temple. This temple guard begins dissecting the body nearby. They desperately avoid drawing its attention. Unfortunately, Layla unintentionally bumps into something, alerting the guard to her presence. The guard approaches where Stephen is hiding, and he lets out a scream, fearing for his life. Layla throws a bottle against the wall to divert the monster's attention, and Stephen instructs her to flee. He pushes down objects to crush the creature. Layla manages to escape, but they become separated. She tries to make her way toward Amit while walking along the edge of the rocks but is pursued by another monster. Eventually escapes the guard by severely injuring it with a flare and hurling it into a pit. Harrow, witnessing this from the opposite side of the pit, cannot reach her due to the lack of a bridge. He attempts to engage her in conversation, bringing up her father and referring to her as my little scarab, a term her father used. This connection draws her into the conversation. Harrow praises her father and suggests that he would be proud of her for confirming that the Egyptian gods walk among humans. He mentions the scales of judgment, which reveal moments of sin and pain, and notes that her husband, Mark, is suffering greatly. Harrow alludes to Mark's undisclosed actions, implying that he is withholding painful truths from her. This revelation leaves Layla feeling betrayed and hurt. She decides to venture deeper into the tomb, presumably to confront Mark about these hidden truths. Harrow receives word from his men that they've found another entrance, and Stephen, who has been engrossed in exploring the tomb, is joined by Mark in a reflection. Mark confronts Stephen about his kiss with Layla and acknowledges that everything Stephen said about pushing her away was accurate but unexpected coming from him. Stephen starts deciphering the hieroglyphics on the tomb, leading him to believe that the sarcophagus may hold Alexander the Great, who was Amit's avatar. He speculates that the Ushabti, hidden by the Egyptians, might be inside the mouth, and eventually, he manages to find it by tearing open the bandages and breaking the jaw. Upon entering, Layla discovers Stephen jubilantly celebrating his successful discovery. However, she is not in a celebratory mood and insists on speaking to Mark to get answers regarding what Harrow had revealed. Stephen then tags Mark into the conversation. Mark's story unfolds, with him clarifying that he did not directly kill Layla's father but was involved as one of the mercenaries. He explains that his partner's greed led to the massacre at the dig site, and although he tried to save Layla's father, he couldn't rescue him in time. Layla accuses him of bringing a killer into her father's life, which he acknowledges. Mark reveals that his boss also shot him, leaving him for dead until Khonshu found and saved him. He confesses that when he had fully recovered, he intended to tell Layla the truth but couldn't bring himself to do it. Layla is most disturbed by the revelation that their marriage was motivated by Mark's guilt over what happened to her father. However, they don't have time to delve deeper into their conversation as they hear Harrow's men approaching. Layla sets off to find an exit while Mark takes on the task of holding off Harrow's men. Harrow arrives and demands the Ushabti from Mark. For a moment, it appears Mark might comply, but instead, he launches an attack on Harrow's men, eliminating them. Frustrated with Mark's resistance, Harrow draws a gun and shoots him twice, emphasizing that he can't save someone unwilling to save themselves. Mark falls into a pool of water, and the scene fades into darkness as he drifts away. The scene then transitions to what seems like an Indiana Jones-style film featuring a character named Dr. Stephen Grant instead of Indiana Jones. This film is playing on a television in a psychiatric hospital. It becomes evident that everything in the mental institution had a connection to Stephen's previous interactions. The gold-painted man, who earlier was the bingo caller, holds a hat for tips. The patient solving a Rubik's Cube is the same cube Stephen was manipulating to stay awake. The orderly distributing food resembles one of Harrow's followers who posed as an agent during Stephen's arrest. Donna, Stephen's former boss, holds a scarab-like toy and hopes for specific bingo calls. The clock in the hospital has a hand resembling Khonshu's staff. The orderly with a cupcake cart was the person encountered during Mark and Layla's meeting with Magar. Beck's cupcake card relates to Stephen and Mark's chase with Harrow's men in a cupcake van. One patient sketches a bird resembling Khonshu, and a goldfish in a bowl matches Gus, Stephen's one-finned fish. The orderly discussing Mark's favorite spot was also one of Harrow's followers, seen with Layla earlier. Layla herself puts up postcards like the ones in Stephen's apartment. She mimics her behavior during the passport arrangement scene. In a therapy session, Mark falls out of his wheelchair, clutching a Moon Knight action figure. His leg is tied to the chair, mirroring Stephen's self-restraint to his bed when talking to the therapist. Surprisingly, the therapist is revealed to be Arthur Harrow. Harrow explains that Mark experienced a mental breakdown, unable to differentiate between reality and fiction due to his obsession with the fictional film Tomb Buster. The painting Mark observes matches the place where Stephen first encountered Harrow and his followers. Harrow elaborates on the film's lunar god and its eccentric villain, drawing parallels with Mark's mental state. Mark also notices Harrow's cane and slippers, the same items Harrow was using and wearing. Everything seems to indicate that Mark might have fabricated everything in his mind and could be suffering from a mental illness. However, Mark firmly remembers Harrow shooting him and has no intention of staying in this situation any longer than necessary. He attempts to escape and, as he runs, notices that the lamps move like Harrow's scales. While being chased, Mark manages to slip into a side room. Inside, he finds a sarcophagus with someone inside screaming for release. Mark opens it, only to discover that the person inside is Stephen Grant. Instead of sharing a body, they are now face to face. Both men are relieved to see each other but are puzzled by how this is even possible. Their immediate concern is finding a way out. In another sarcophagus, someone is also screaming for release, but they don't pay much attention. As they exit the room, they encounter an Egyptian hippo god waving at them. The episode begins in a cave with a boy calling for help, followed by a woman blaming him. Then, it returns to where the previous episode left off, introducing the hippo character and the perplexed reactions of Mark and Stephen. However, instead of immediately addressing the hippo's identity, the scene shifts back to Harrow's office. Mark, with a broken nose that he didn't have in the previous scene, is conversing with Harrow in the office. Harrow denies shooting him and suggests that Mark's mind is oscillating between reality and a comforting self-created fantasy. He reveals that Mark is his patient at the Putnam Medical Facility in Chicago, Illinois. Mark questions Harrow's credentials as a doctor, and Harrow explains that it's not about him. Harrow asks Mark to retrace his steps, and Mark recounts being in a place resembling Harrow's office, but with a hippo instead of a rhinoceros. Harrow inquires whether this makes sense or not, and Mark agrees. Harrow explains that the mind sometimes constructs places to seek shelter from traumatic memories, calling it an organizing principle. Mark adds, or a psych ward, to which Harrow agrees. Harrow finds the new character, the hippo, intriguing, as it might help bridge the gap between Mark and Steven's understanding. When Harrow asks about the boy Mark mentioned, Mark's demeanor changes slightly, and he expresses gratitude before grabbing a crystal pyramid, appearing ready to use it as a weapon. Harrow activates the emergency button to summon the guards. As the guards restrain Mark, he starts yelling that they should release that monster, questioning Harrow's legitimacy as a doctor, and displaying a voice that doesn't quite seem like Mark or Steven's usual demeanor. It becomes apparent that the person currently in control is a completely different personality, exhibiting a demeanor distinct from both Mark and Steven. This new personality emerges when Mark takes over the body and discovers a knife in his hand, plunged into another person. He looks around in confusion and asks Steven what he did, to which Steven denies any involvement. This situation, along with the screams from the other sarcophagus, confirms the presence of a third personality within the same body. However, when Mark is injected, he cries out in pain. The narrative then shifts back to the hippo, who confirms that they are in the Jewat, the Egyptian underworld. She identifies herself as Tauret, the goddess of women and children, as well as the one who guides souls through the afterlife. Steven, being somewhat knowledgeable about Egyptian mythology, recognizes her and grasps the situation but is visibly shocked. An interesting point is raised by Tauret when she mentions that this is an afterlife, not the afterlife. She explains that there are different realms within it, implying that not all individuals go to the same realm after death. She even mentions the ancestral planes, suggesting that the afterlife experience is tailored to the deceased person's state of mind. In Mark and Steven's case, it manifests as an asylum, reflecting their perception of themselves as insane. Tauret elaborates on this, emphasizing that the afterlife may appear differently to different individuals based on their understanding. Mark concedes that Dr. Harrow was correct, and this is an organizing principle. Despite their unique experience, Steven is surprised to learn that Harrow is indeed a doctor, though he maintains that they aren't truly insane. Mark proceeds to open a door, leading to the afterlife. Tauret's boat is transporting them toward judgment. Steven identifies their destination as Aru, the field of reeds, which is essentially the Egyptian version of heaven. However, Tauret explains that they must undergo judgment first, wherein their hearts will be weighed on the scale of justice. The central statue represents Anubis, the god of the dead. In Egyptian belief, the heart signifies a person's true nature in life. If the scales balance by journey's end, the soul is permitted to enter the field of reeds. Mark inquires about the consequences if the scales don't balance, to which Tauret replies that unbalanced souls will be dragged down into the Jewat, forever frozen in the sand. However, Tauret raises a concern that their hearts aren't in balance because they are concealing something from each other. She clarifies that the boat holds all their life memories, and they must enter it to work out their issues, leaving no room for secrets. Steven inquires about Layla's well-being, and Mark suggests she might embark on a risky mission to confront Harrow herself. It becomes evident that Mark's memories are fragmented, and the story delves into some of their older memories, including a street scene that Steven asks Mark if he remembers, but Mark dismisses it as just a street. They enter a room where several revelations unfold. They come face to face with the deceased individuals whom Mark had killed during his time as a mercenary. Steven inquires if Mark remembers them, and Mark responds that they were criminals, murderers, and predators, the worst of the worst. Khonshu, the lunar god, had desired their punishment, and Mark had often wished for failure, hoping that one of these criminals would kill him instead. The healing powers granted by Khonshu had turned out to be more of a curse than a blessing. As they observe, they notice that the scales used for judgment are slowing down, signifying that the process is taking effect. However, there's a young boy present in the room, someone Mark recognizes but Steven does not. This baffles Steven, and he decides to pursue the child into another room, locking Mark out despite Mark's pleas to open the door. Inside the room, Steven encounters a profound revelation. He sees Mark's family, including a brother whom Steven had never known about. He witnesses Mark and his brother drawing a one-fin fish. Mark's memory unfolds further as he recalls that he and his brother, Roro, decided not to eat and went to play in a cave. His mother reminded them to look after each other, and they agreed before Mark said, "Laters, gators," and his brother responded with, "In a while, crocodile." They entered the cave, but it started raining heavily, making the cave dangerous as water began rising from the bottom. Stephen, in this memory, calls to the boys to leave, while Mark, who is outside, desperately implores Stephen to come back. Young Mark calls for his brother, "Follow my voice," but Roro, in the memory, expresses a longing for their mother. Stephen hears this, but it's just a memory, and sadly, Mark's brother perishes in the memory. The scene transitions to Mark's mother expressing her desire to have her son back. And when Mark descends the stairs, his mother berates him, blaming him for everything. He goes upstairs with Stephen following him. There's another scene showing Mark's father calling for his mother to blow out the candles, but she doesn't respond. His father explains that she's not feeling well and reassures that they will celebrate together this year. However, she makes his life miserable, and it becomes evident that dealing with the death of her son was incredibly challenging. Another memory reveals a different birthday, with Mark's mother accusing him of being jealous of his deceased brother. She should have known, she says, that Mark would do something like this. Stephen questions her actions, but Mark grabs him, taking them into a desert landscape. Here, they discover dead bodies, and Stephen confronts Mark, mentioning that Harrow claimed Mark was a mercenary who had killed hostages. Mark proceeds to share his backstory. He explains that he was in the military before being discharged for going AWOL in a fugue state, which means leaving without official leave. With limited options, he turned to work for hire under his leader. The story then unravels the full account of what happened to Layla's father. Mark reveals that he and an old partner named Bushman were on a mission in Egypt to raid an Egyptian tomb. However, Bushman altered the plan, opting for no witnesses, and ended up killing everyone on the site. Mark resisted, but Bushman ultimately defeated him. As he lay dying, Mark crawled to a statue of Khonshu, and at that moment, Khonshu made a pact with him. He gave Mark a choice to live or die but bound him to be his instrument, his eyes, his hands, and his vengeance, to eliminate only those who truly deserved it. We come to realize that Khonshu has indeed been manipulating Mark due to what he perceives as Mark's fractured mind. Khonshu poses a question: "Do you swear to protect the travelers of the night and bring my vengeance to those who would do them harm?" Mark responds affirmatively, saying yes. Khonshu then commands him to rise and live again, as my fist of vengeance, as my moon knight. However, our focus shifts back to Towrit and her boat. She observes that souls are undergoing judgment and being condemned to the sands before their natural time, indicating that they are not yet deceased but are being judged while alive. This is precisely what Harrow and Amit have been doing, prematurely judging people. Towrit deems this action as malevolent and wrong. This situation prompts Mark and Stephen to present their case to Towrit, as they need to return and stop Harrow and Amit. Yet, a dilemma arises. If they return to their wounded body, they risk dying again. Towrit suggests that if they can bring Khonshu back, he can provide them with the Moon Knight suit, which possesses healing abilities. Stephen proposes sending word to Layla to help free Khonshu, and Towrit can then send them back into a healed body. However, two challenges remain. First, the scales of judgment are still unbalanced, potentially trapping them in the underworld. Second, they must pass through Osiris's gates to return. Towrit steers her ship toward the gates but instructs Mark and Stephen to delve into their hidden truths once more. Stephen anticipates that the crucial secret lies within the bedroom, which Mark had been reluctant to explore earlier. Mark pleads with him not to go there, promising to reveal everything instead. Stephen warns that if anything goes wrong, it will be Mark's responsibility. This exchange leads us back to Harrow's office. In Harrow's office, Harrow delves into Mark's psychological turmoil, questioning whether Stephen was created to shield Mark from the guilt he feels or if Stephen was Mark's way of exacting punishment on the world for what Mark's mother did to him. Harrow suggests that there is only one way to find out: by opening up to Stephen. Returning to the room with the traumatic memories, Mark's mother frantically pounds on his door, seeking to chastise him. Mark is unwilling to confront his mother's presence. Surprisingly, we witness Mark breathing life into Stephen, unveiling the revelation that Stephen is the constructed persona designed to embody happiness and carefreeness. Additionally, it is disclosed that Mark's mother is deceased, raising questions about whom Mark had been conversing with on the phone all along. Following his mother's funeral, it seems that Stephen is conversing with someone as Mark silently watches the mourners gathered at the house, choosing not to engage with them during a time typically reserved for processing and sharing grief. However, Mark is reluctant to confront these painful memories, and this is precisely why he conjured Stephen and brought him to life. Instead of facing his past, Stephen emerges in a state of confusion, not knowing his whereabouts. He instinctively assumes that he's experiencing another episode of nighttime wandering, akin to sleepwalking. He takes out his phone and appears to engage in a conversation, acknowledging that he has repeated this behavior. Notably, it's not his mother he's talking to, as she is deceased. It's possible he is speaking to himself. Mark holds himself responsible for their childhood visit to the cave, but Stephen reassures him, telling him that he was just a child and that it wasn't his fault. Returning to the top of the ship, They find that the scales of judgment remain unbalanced. Towert expresses her regret, indicating that the underworld is on the verge of claiming them. Ghostly apparitions of the individuals Mark had killed materialize on the ship, intent on dragging him to the underworld to make him a permanent part of it. Overwhelmed by their presence, Mark initially struggles to handle them. However, Stephen recognizes that if Mark can confront them, so can he, as they are essentially the same person. Stephen steps up to the challenge and saves the day. But tragically, this heroic act costs him his own life. Finally, the scales of judgment become balanced. Now, Mark must confront his past without the coping mechanism of Stephen. The remainder of his journey is a path he must navigate alone. With the scales now balanced and everything laid bare, Stephen acknowledges that he was a persona created by Mark to avoid dealing with difficult issues. Now that Mark has faced those challenges, he must continue on his own. As Mark ventures forward, he finds himself in the field of reeds, essentially heaven. The narrative then shifts to the moment when Harrow shot Mark's specter, ending his life. Harrow and his men retrieve Mark's body from the water, determined to obtain Amit's Ushapti. Harrow offers a cold reflection on the need for a stark confrontation with death to grasp reality and asks who desires to heal the world. His staff undergoes a transformation, with one crocodile head, symbolizing Amit, now replaced by an axe. Meanwhile, Layla remains concealed. Harrow leaves the scarab on Mark's body, knowing it serves as a compass pointing to Amit's Ushapti. They proceed to the Great Pyramid of Giza. Layla bids farewell to Mark, taking possession of the scarab and using it to track Harrow's location. Along their journey to the pyramid, Harrow encounters the Egyptian patrol agency. Confident in his newfound power, he disregards the guns aimed at him and proceeds to pass judgment, causing the premature deaths of those judged. Some may not have even committed the sins that would condemn them, leaving only one man spared by Harrow's judgment. Layla manages to infiltrate one of Arthur's trucks, posing as one of his followers. Her intention is to assassinate him, but her plan is interrupted when the Egyptian goddess Towert communicates with her through the medium of the deceased bodies. Layla conveys to Towert that Mark could potentially return, but she urges Layla to halt her pursuit because Harrow's power is overwhelming. To thwart Harrow, they require the intervention of Khonshu. Towert instructs Layla to shatter Harrow's Ushapti in the Chamber of the Gods. She also suggests that Layla could become her avatar, given the commendations Mark made about her. However, Layla believes she can proceed on her own and continues to trail Harrow. The avatars and their corresponding gods sense a disturbance, though some are initially uncertain of its nature. Cather's avatar eventually discerns that someone is attempting to release Amit, validating what Khonshu and Mark had asserted from the outset. This dire situation could have been avoided. Harrow arrives and attempts to dissuade them, emphasizing their role as judges rather than warriors. Nonetheless, they engage in combat with him, but Harrow emerges victorious, deeming the conflict unnecessary. Harrow breaches the statue to unleash Amit, who appears disoriented and inquires, "To whom do I owe my gratitude?" Harrow identifies himself as her humble disciple to whom she owes nothing. She remarks on his unbalanced scales due to what lies ahead for him. Harrow acknowledges that he had hoped his penance might correct this imbalance but accepts the scales regardless of the outcome. Notably, Amit reveals that Harrow did not possess the staff. It was originally bestowed upon her first avatar, clarifying that he merely wielded its contained power. Harrow resigns himself to the likely prospect of his demise and mentions his devoted disciples who worship her, their scales in perfect balance. Amit perceives Harrow as the one who set her free and identifies him as the avatar she needs. She offers him peace, urging him not to let the pain of the past control him. Harrow accepts her offer, believing in his mission despite the inevitable casualties it may entail. Meanwhile, Layla succeeds in freeing Khonshu. He cannot sense Mark's specter in this world and presumes that he perished in battle. Khonshu proposes that Layla become his avatar, but she discerns his manipulative intentions and declines, citing Mark's lack of trust in him as her rationale. They agree to cooperate without her becoming subservient to him. Khonshu then attempts to rebind Amit, asserting that only an avatar can accomplish this task. Layla, once again, refuses to oblige. As Amit suggests cleansing the souls of Cairo and beyond, Khonshu intervenes. Towert comments on how time has affected him, and he warns her that he cannot permit her to proceed. The narrative shifts to Mark in the field of reeds, where Stephen remains trapped in the sand, frozen. It becomes evident that this paradise is not genuine, but rather a manifestation of the peace Mark has longed for but never truly experienced. Yet, he couldn't truly find peace, knowing that Stephen remained trapped in the sand. This supposed paradise would never be genuine for him. So, he returns to Stephen, frozen in the sand right in front of the Gate of Osiris. Mark delivers a heartfelt speech, expressing gratitude for Stephen's companionship and how it saved him. As he turns to sand glass, they are both resurrected, their souls returning to their injured body. Together, they pass through the gate. Meanwhile, Khonshu attempts to confront Amit himself. Amit expresses her purpose is to bring balance, but Khonshu questions her choice of avatar, who he considers a sinner. She accuses Khonshu of jealousy and claims he wants to keep her bound. This dispute escalates into a massive godly battle, where Amit appears to have the upper hand due to Khonshu lacking an avatar. Mark and Steven are healed and resurrected, with Khonshu sensing Mark's presence in this world and vanishing. Flashbacks from Mark's memories reveal Khonshu wrapping them in Moon Knight robes, preparing them for battle. Before proceeding, they renegotiate their deal with Khonshu, who informs them that Amit has been freed and he needs their help. Khonshu explains that he will release Mark and Steven and changes the night sky to facilitate their journey to Cairo. As they prepare, Steven hands over control of the body to Mark. Meanwhile, the avatar of Osiris informs Layla that they require more avatars and a plan to trap Amit in a mortal body, making her vulnerable. He then passes away. Harrow notices them and destroys the chamber, trapping Layla inside. Layla accepts Tauret's offer to become her temporary avatar. Atop the pyramid, Harrow signals Amit's disciples, who begin to judge those around them, sending unbalanced souls to Amit. Amit grows to an immense size as she consumes more souls. Layla appears in an outfit resembling Tauret's, equipped with twin short swords and wings. Moon Knight confronts Harrow as Amit watches. Harrow engages in combat with Mark and Steven, while Khonshu manifests into a giant form to face Amit. During the battle, Layla intervenes to assist Mark and Steven. Harrow's disciples arrive, ready to fight, and Steven demonstrates some of their skills to Layla. Amit and Khonshu engage in a debate about the morality of their causes, discussing their respective methods of dealing with sinners. Khonshu argues that he waits until the sin is committed, while Amit acts in prejudgment. Moon Knight and Layla team up to face Harrow and his men, with Steven and Mark swapping suits to utilize different powers. During the battle, Harrow distracts Layla by threatening a group hiding in a van. Layla intervenes to save them, and one of the survivors asks if she is an Egyptian superhero, which she confirms. Harrow taunts Mark, suggesting that if Amit had ruled, Mark's brother would still be alive because Amit would have killed Mark before he committed any wrongdoing. As Mark watches Amit strike down Khonshu, Harrow impales Mark with his staff, leading to another blackout for Mark. He regains consciousness while holding Harrow's staff to his head and asks Steven if he did it, to which Steven denies involvement. Layla manages to free herself and inquires about what happened to Mark. He informs her of the blackout and his lack of memory. Layla reveals that she knows how to defeat Amit and instructs Mark to bring Harrow along. Mark carries Harrow to the chamber and places him on an altar. Layla explains that they can use the room to bind Amit to Harrow's body. As Amit realizes what's happening, she pleads with Khonshu, but he declares that it's over. Amit becomes bound to Harrow, who warns that she will never be contained. Khonshu instructs Mark to end her, and Mark prepares to kill Harrow to achieve this. However, Layla reminds Mark that he is free to choose, even though Khonshu demands vengeance. Mark insists that Khonshu should take responsibility for killing Amit himself and orders him to release them, which Khonshu does. The scene shifts back to Mark and Steven with Dr. Harrow, who notices that they are still working together and in sync. They observe blood on Harrow's foot, and Mark and Steven realize that it's all in their heads. They choose to wake up and find themselves in Steven's apartment, tied to the bedpost, with 2 goldfish present. Mark tries to get up but falls out of bed. Later on, we see Harrow as a patient at Sincuix Psychiatric Hospital, sedated and unable to pick up his coffee cup. A man in a black suit speaks Spanish and escorts Harrow, who notices dead bodies as he is wheeled to a limousine. Khonshu is inside and explains that he never released Mark because Mark didn't fully comprehend how disturbed he was. Khonshu introduces Harrow to Jake Lockley, Mark's third personality, the murderous spirit of vengeance that took over during every blackout and always led the body back to the flat in London. Jake shoots Harrow twice with a silenced pistol before driving Khonshu away. That's all for today, folks. Like, share, and subscribe for more such content. Curious Knight signing off. Stay safe, stay curious.